Have you ever had a friend just completely fail to text you back?
Oh, absolutely. It's the worst feeling.
Right. Like you send the message, maybe it's a quick joke or, a question about weekend plans, and then nothing.
With those terrible read receipts staring back at you.
Exactly. Or even worse, you see the little typing bubble appear for a few agonizing seconds and then it just vanishes.
Yeah, that is pure anxiety right there.
It really is. And what happens next? If you are anything like the rest of us, you do not just calmly set your phone down and assume, oh, they got distracted by a shining object or work emergency.
No, of course not.
No, you spend the next hour convincing yourself that the friendship is secretly over. You mentally scroll through the last 6 months of your relationship, searching for that one awkward thing you said at a dinner party.
Right, you start playing detective.
Yes. You start piecing together completely unrelated events, like a slightly short tone of voice they used 3 weeks ago, a canceled coffee date last month, and suddenly you are completely certain that this silence is their ultimate, final judgment of you as a human being.
And then an hour later, your phone buzzes.
Right. They text back, sorry, dropped my phone in the sink, and in a split second, your reality just snaps back into place.
It is an incredibly universal experience. I mean, we've all been there.
Yeah.
And it perfectly illustrates just how fragile our perception of reality really is. It shows us how quickly and, effortlessly our minds will construct an entire fictional universe just to fill in a blank space.
Which is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. We are looking into a truly fascinating stack of research, psychological studies, and historical observations all centered around one theme, which is the stories we tell ourselves.
It's such a great topic.
It really is. Our goal today is to uncover how our brains are constantly weaving these intricate narratives, how those internal stories literally shape the physical reality we experience, and most importantly, how you can learn to tell the difference between objective, hard truth, and a fictional narrative you've unknowingly created in your own head.
Because that distinction is everything.
Exactly. So we're going to look at the underlying mechanics of the mind, the invisible traps we set for ourselves, and how to actually break out of them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does this constant, almost obsessive need to spin a story actually come from?
Well, it fundamentally comes down to how the human brain manages its own energy. The core concept running through all the research we're looking at is that every single human being is a storyteller.
Right.
Now, there is a crucial distinction we need to make right out of the gate here. We are not storytellers because we all sit down to write novels, or because we all stand before audiences giving grand theatrical speeches.
Right. It's not about being a literal author. Exactly. We are storytellers because every moment of every single day, our minds are quietly, relentlessly generating explanations for the raw data of our lives.
It makes me think of like a background app running on your phone.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like you don't even know it's open, but it's just sitting there draining the battery with all this constant processing, trying to refresh a feed you aren't even looking at.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The brain does not simply operate like a passive recording device, just capturing raw, unfiltered footage of your day. If it did, the sheer volume of information would overwhelm us instantly.
Let me just short circuit.
Pretty much. Instead, it acts as a meaning-making machine. It takes a few scattered data points and immediately drafts a script to connect them. Think about a really common scenario. Say a coworker walks past your desk and doesn't say hello.
Okay, yeah.
That is the raw data, the objective event. But the mind hates a mystery, so it immediately begins to draft an explanation. It whispers, they must be angry with me about that meeting yesterday.
Even if there's no proof of that at all.
Right. The objective reality might be that they were simply lost in thought, agonizing over their own grocery list or sick child at home. But the mind actually prefers a painful story to an unresolved mystery.
Wow. Or like you fail at something important, you bomb a presentation, and the mind doesn't just say, that presentation went poorly. It immediately scales up and declares, I'm a failure. I always mess these things up.
And that jump from an isolated event to a permanent identity is where things get really complicated. Because the event itself only happens once. The coworker walks past, the phone call is missed, the presentation ends.
Right.
But the story we attach to that event, that narrative continues to loop in our heads for days, months, sometimes years. One of the most striking observations from the behavioral research is that two people can experience the exact same objective event and walk away living in entirely different realities.
That's wild to think about.
It is. One person experiences a job loss and sees a crushing permanent defeat. Another person experiences the exact same job loss and sees a necessary redirection or a fresh beginning.
And the actual physical event didn't change at all.
Not one bit. The only variable that changed was the story they assigned to the event.
But if we know this, if we know that these internal stories are often wildly inaccurate or cause us unnecessary pain, why on earth is the brain so obsessed with generating them? I mean, why wouldn't it just prefer the objective truth?
Because the alternative, living in a world without narrative coherence, is terrifying to the human nervous system. Without stories, life would feel like a chaotic storm of disconnected events.
We need things to make sense.
Exactly. Stories create order. They allow us to categorize information, predict what might happen tomorrow, and ultimately, from an evolutionary standpoint, they help us survive. A brain that can connect cause and effect, even if the connection is completely wrong, feels like it has some semblance of control over a very dangerous, unpredictable world.
You know, it really feels like the autocorrect feature on a smartphone.
Oh, so.
Well, we've all had those moments where we're typing a message really fast. Maybe we type the letters C-O-N, and the phone doesn't just leave it alone. It's overzealous.
Right, it jumps in.
Yeah, it looks at the incomplete data, panics, and tries to fill in the blanks to save time. It wants to complete the thought for you, but so often it autocorrects to the absolute worst, most embarrassing, or most catastrophic possible word.
Oh, definitely. We've all sent those texts.
Right, and our brains are essentially doing the exact same thing with our lives. We see a blank space, a lack of a smile, a lack of a text message, and our mental autocorrect just slams in the worst-case scenario without waiting for more information.
That autocorrect analogy is perfect because it highlights a mechanism rather than just a flaw. The brain's autocorrect is just trying to be efficient. It's trying to resolve ambiguity fast.
Makes sense.
And for our ancient ancestors, this mental autocorrect feature was incredibly useful. Think about it. If an early human saw a rustling in the bushes, the ones whose brains instantly autocorrected to, "it's a tiger, run," were the ones who survived.
Right, better safe than sorry.
Exactly. The ones who said, "well, let's gather more data, maybe it's just the wind," didn't live long enough to pass on their genes.
So we literally inherited the DNA of the most anxious, quick to jump to conclusions humans that ever lived.
We really did.
But if this survival mechanism is so deeply hardwired into our biology, what happens when it gets hijacked in a modern world where, the biggest daily threat isn't a tiger, but an unread email?
Well, what's fascinating here is the actual neuroscience behind how a passing, anxious thought solidifies into a permanent reality. It isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. It is purely biological.
Like the physical hardware.
Yes. The psychological literature relies heavily on a principle called Hebbian learning. The simple way to summarize it is, neurons that fire together wire together. Every time you have a thought, an electrical signal travels across a specific pathway of neurons in your brain.
So it's a physical process, not just a mental one.
Highly physical. Think of your brain like a massive landscape of solid rock, and a new thought is a tiny trickle of water. The first time you think, "I'm not good enough," that trickle of water finds a small groove.
Okay.
But if you think that same thought every single day for 10 years, that trickle becomes a rushing river, and eventually it carves a massive deep canyon into the rock. Once that canyon is formed, any new water, any new thought or experience will naturally just flow right down into it because it is the path of least resistance.
So the more you think a thought, the easier it is for the brain to just default to it automatically.
Exactly. And eventually the story no longer feels like a narrative you are actively choosing. It feels like an undeniable atmospheric truth.
Just the way things are.
Right. The subconscious mind absorbs these sweeping narratives, stories like "I am not intelligent," or "people will always betray me," or "the world is fundamentally out to get me." Once the canyon is deep enough, the conscious mind just lives down there in the dark, rarely ever questioning if there's a world above the rim. We just accept it as the absolute truth.
Okay, wait. I want to push back on this a little bit because this is exactly what people wonder when they hear this stuff.
Sure, go for it.
If I've failed 10 times at something, let's say I've tried to start a business 10 times and gone bankrupt every time, isn't the story "I always fail" just an accurate description of reality? Isn't that just being completely realistic based on the data?
That is the most natural pushback possible, and it's something cognitive behavioral therapists deal with constantly. Yes, some stories are heavily grounded in evidence the events happened, but the real question is whether the story you are telling yourself is complete.
What do you mean by complete?
Well, let's break down your specific example. I have started 10 businesses and they all went bankrupt. That is a fact. It is objective, observable data. You can put it on a spreadsheet.
Right.
But the thought, I always fail, is a generalization. And to maintain that generalization, your brain requires you to completely ignore every single success you've ever had in your life. It demands that you ignore every skill you've ever managed to learn, every obstacle you've ever overcome, every relationship you've ever built.
Oh, I see.
It takes one specific data point, business failures, and stretches it like a dark blanket over your entire existence.
I see where you're going with this. It's not that the failure didn't happen. It's that the brain uses that one failure to paint the whole canvas black.
Precisely. And the reason the brain paints the whole canvas black goes back to what we call the negativity bias. Human beings have a deeply ingrained biological tendency to weight negative experiences far more heavily than positive ones.
Right, because of the tiger in the bushes.
Exactly. If you receive 10 glowing compliments on a project or one slightly critical piece of feedback, which one keeps you awake at 2 in the morning?
Oh, the criticism, 100%.
Evolution shaped that bias. Remembering where the poisonous berries are is vastly more important for your immediate survival than remembering where the pretty flowers are.
But we aren't foraging for berries anymore.
This raises an important question, though. How does this ancient survival mechanism distort our modern self-perception? Because we are no longer running from predators, but our brains are still reacting to a failed math test or a bad job interview or a rejection letter with the exact same life or death intensity.
That's exhausting.
It is. We build an entire identity around our perceived threats and failures because our brain thinks it is keeping us safe by keeping us hypervigilant.
So if we are biologically hardwired to groove these negative pathways, to weight the bad heavier than the good, and to autocorrect to the worst-case scenario, it sounds a bit like a prison sentence.
It can definitely feel that way.
Yeah. If the brain naturally carves these deep canyons of self-doubt, how on earth do we climb out of them?
We climb out by understanding that if a canyon was carved, a new one can be carved.
Yeah.
We have to realize that we have the power to edit the manuscript.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the research we reviewed introduces this concept of the blank slate. The underlying premise is so simple, but so profound. No child is born into this world believing they are a failure.
That's right.
Like, a baby doesn't emerge into the world thinking, I'm inherently unlovable, or I'm just not a math person. The painful events in our lives absolutely happen, yes, but the meaning we attach to those events is entirely learned over time.
And that realization is the ultimate key to psychological liberation. If the meaning is learned, that means it can be unlearned. It can be re-examined. We mentioned the deep canyons in the brain earlier, but what we didn't mention is neuroplasticity.
Okay, tell us about that.
Your brain is not fixed like a static piece of hardware. It is highly plastic, meaning it is constantly remodeling itself based on your experiences and your focus. Think of your brain like a massive city grid. If a major highway, a negative thought pattern, is causing traffic jams and accidents, you don't have to keep driving on it.
You can take a detour.
Exactly. Neuroplasticity allows you to physically lay down new asphalt, build a new bypass, and over time, if you stop using the old highway, the brain will literally break it down and reabsorb those resources.
And just to be clear, the clinical data strongly emphasizes we are not talking about fantasy here.
No, not at all.
This isn't about adopting some toxic positivity where you look at a burning building and say, what a lovely campfire.
Right, it's not delusion.
It's not about pretending painful things don't hurt. It is about learning to tell stories that are simply more complete, more accurate, and more compassionate toward yourself.
Exactly. The historical record is incredibly rich with people who utilize this exact mechanism. They looked at the devastating raw data of their lives and aggressively decided to write a completely different story than the one society or their circumstances handed them.
Any examples stand out?
Take Viktor Frankl, for example.
Yeah.
He was a psychiatrist who was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp. He was stripped of his freedom, his dignity, his family, everything. The objective raw data of his life was pure, unadulterated horror.
You literally cannot autocorrect to a worse scenario than what he actually lived through.
Right. But Frankl realized that while his captors could control every physical aspect of his existence, they could not control the meaning he attached to his suffering.
Wow.
He decided that his suffering would not just be meaningless torture, it would be an observation. He studied his fellow prisoners, he helped them find meaning, and he survived to write Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most influential psychological books of the 20th century.
That's incredible.
The camp remained a factual part of his history. The raw data didn't change, but he refused to let that event become the final, defining chapter of his story.
Or you look at someone like Thomas Edison. The famous story goes that he failed thousands of times to create a working light bulb filament.
Right, the classic example.
Yeah, if he had let his internal narrator write the story would have been, I'm a failure and I'm wasting my life. But he supposedly reframed it entirely, saying he hadn't failed, he had just successfully found 10,000 ways that won't work. It's such a masterful example of taking the exact same data point and just swapping out the narrative lens.
And that really gets to the core of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is all about recognizing those distorted thoughts, challenging their accuracy, and replacing them with healthier, more realistic narratives.
It really makes you rethink the definition of maturity, because we often think of maturity as just enduring hardship. But looking at this, maturity isn't about pretending that painful experiences never happened, and it's not about burying your head in the sand.
No, it's much deeper than that.
Real maturity is the deep structural realization that one single chapter does not define the entire book. You might have lived through a horrific, tragic, deeply painful chapter. The raw data of that chapter might be brutal, but you are still holding the pen for the next one.
That ability to rewrite a narrative, to look at a story and intentionally change its trajectory is undeniably one of the most powerful tools human beings possess. And what is truly remarkable is that this phenomenon doesn't just happen inside the isolated minds of individuals.
It scales up.
It scales up massively. The very same storytelling instincts that shape a single person's identity also shape the destiny of entire civilizations.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out? We've been talking entirely about the micro level, the unreturned text messages, the personal failures, the internal neuroplasticity. But how does humanity use these narrative mechanics on a macro level?
Well, on a macro level, civilizations, cultures, and belief systems are the ultimate storytellers. They provide the grand, overarching narratives that allow millions of strangers to cooperate.
Okay, like what kind of narratives?
Think about something as foundational as currency, or human rights, or national borders. Now, if you look at these purely through a sociological lens, and I want to be very clear here, we are doing this without taking sides on any specific political or religious belief. You realize that none of these things exist in physical nature.
Right.
You can't point to a human right under a microscope. You can't find the value of a dollar bill in its chemical composition.
They only exist because a massive group of humans all agreed to believe the same story about them.
Precisely. They are shared fictions, macro narratives. Society tells stories about who belongs and who doesn't. Stories about what constitutes progress, about justice, about what it means to be a good citizen.
So it's like a collective autocorrect?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
They tell us who we are as a collective, why we are here on this planet, and what happens to us when we die. These massive stories provide the invisible scaffolding that holds human culture together.
And depending on the story, that scaffolding can either build a beautiful shelter or it can build a cage. History shows us that some of these grand societal stories have united generations. They have inspired art, brought immense comfort in times of crisis, and fostered massive cooperation.
But on the flip side, we also see how other macro narratives have been strategically utilized to create deeply entrenched divisions.
Right.
Stories have been used to dehumanize the other, to justify wars, and to rationalize systemic suffering. Again, just looking at the source material objectively, the psychological mechanism is exactly the same as the individual mind. The civilization is just using a story to make sense of a chaotic world, but when it scales up to millions of people, the stakes become infinitely higher.
And it seems like we are living through a time where a lot of those macro narratives are clashing loudly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sociological data argues that the future of any civilization fundamentally depends on its relationship to its own stories.
Oh.
It depends on having the wisdom to preserve the narratives that truly serve humanity, the ones that promote flourishing, empathy, and collective growth. But equally, it requires the profound courage to rewrite the stories that no longer serve us.
We have to evaluate them.
We must. It requires us to hold these massive macro stories up to the harsh light of evidence and ask, is this story actually moving us closer to reality and connection, or is it driving us further apart?
Which brings this grand, sweeping philosophical concept right back down to the most intimate, personal level for you listening right now. The goal of this deep dive isn't to force you to abandon your stories. We certainly aren't saying your beliefs, your cultural background, or your personal history are invalid.
Absolutely not.
The goal is simply to invite you to examine them, to pull them out of the subconscious background, put them on the table, and really look at them.
The question is not whether we tell stories. We cannot avoid it. It is literally how our brains are wired to function.
Right.
The only real question is whether we have the courage to examine them. Do your personal stories encourage curiosity, or do they breed fear? Do they foster compassion for yourself and others, or do they sow division and resentment? Do they lead to personal growth, or do they trap you in a canyon of resignation?
As we wrap up this deep dive into the mind's editing room, we want to remind you of the ultimate takeaway here. You cannot stop your brain from trying to weave narratives. The mental autocorrect is always going to be running in the background.
It's just what brains do.
But wisdom begins when we finally realize that while the mind is a truly wonderful storyteller, it is a highly inaccurate historian. It is an unreliable narrator sitting right in the center of your consciousness, and it does not always have your best interests in mind.
And that is the challenge we want to leave you with today. We encourage you directly refuse to let yesterday's story imprison tomorrow's possibilities. The next time you face a setback, before you automatically ask the default question, what happened to me? Which almost always leads straight down that well-worn canyon of victimhood or negativity, try asking a much quieter, much more powerful question.
What's that?
Ask yourself, what story have I been telling myself about what just happened? And is that story the absolute only one that could possibly be true?
It's a total paradigm shift. Think about how you consume news in the modern world. If you're watching a television broadcast and you knew for a fact that the network was heavily biased, known for constantly exaggerating the negative and totally ignoring the positive, you wouldn't just blindly accept a reporting as absolute, unquestionable fact.
No, you'd question it.
Exactly. You would want to verify their sources. You would look for a second opinion. So why do you accept the continuous 24/7 broadcasts of your own internal self-doubt without ever demanding a fact check? The next time your internal narrator tells you a painful story about who you are or what that unreturned text message really means, ask to see their sources.